Welcome to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio, and you can find us on our website, thewww.wine. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. How are you today, Kim?
I'm doing well, Mark. How about yourself?
Everything is great. And once again, we welcome a very special guest today, Colonel Craig Duncan. Colonel, how are you today?
Doing great. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate having the chance to meet you guys and all the wonderful things in Massachusetts that you guys do.
It's great to have you. And you are our first guest to talk about liquor, and we're going to focus on whiskey. So Colonel Craig is the founder and president of Whiskey University, and I have the pleasure of being enrolled in Whiskey University. All the years I've been in retail, I thought I knew what I was supposed to know, Colonel, about the whiskey world, and I'm learning I don't, and I'm very appreciative for all that you do. And first, I'd like you to tell your story and your journey in whiskey and how you got to become a colonel.
Sure. In 2009, two buddies and I went on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. That was back when there was only 8 distilleries on it. Now there are currently 54. So that was way back in the day. We did it over a Friday and a Saturday. And those 8 distilleries, we were so impressed with not only the whiskeys and bourbons, but more importantly, the historical facts that were tied to companies, the brands, etc., that we decided to collect the whiskeys from those 8 distilleries. And within about 6 months, I'd say we had about 150 whiskeys, and we'd start teaching each other about those. As time went on, we developed a social group or a social club. We got 15 people, then 26 people, then 35 people. And during this social gathering on the second and fourth Thursday of every month, all we would do is teach formal classes about different types of whiskey. Well, things progressed. We started putting them on PowerPoint. Then we were starting to kind of make our rounds. So we were invited to go to Facebook groups, whiskey and bourbon Facebook groups throughout Tennessee and Kentucky, and speak to them. And man, everybody just loved it. So at that point, we said to ourselves, there's this much appetite for whiskey with these people. Is there in the general population or general public? And we decided to test it out. We started basically teaching at one restaurant in Columbia, Tennessee, about 45 minutes south of Nashville. It went over like gangbusters. We had 7 classes, and then the chain that we taught at invited us to teach at their other 10 locations, 9 in Tennessee, 1 in Alabama, and things were going fantastic. We started enrolling new instructors, new students, and then COVID hit. When COVID hit, we transitioned from doing 90% in person, 10% online, to 95% online, 5 or 10% in person. And we started teaching in the Eastern and Central time zone, not just confining ourselves to Tennessee and Kentucky. Things started picking up. And since that time, we are now in all 50 states, 10 Canadian provinces, Puerto Rico, the UK, and Northern Ireland, with not only students, over 2,000 degreed students have graduated from us, with over 7,000 or 8,000 students, but degreed students, 2,000. We teach 130 different classes, and we have instructors in all those areas that I mentioned. So we teach in-person classes and we teach online classes, which brings us to where we are now, teaching 11 classes a week online that you can take right from your own living room. We actually give 5 classes absolutely free that they could find out on our website. We do bourbon, rye whiskey, Tennessee whiskey, Canadian whiskey, and world whiskey certificate programs where we give you 5 classes for free, of which you're required to take 4 of those 5 in order to earn a certificate with us. And if you decide you want to move on after that, get a little more in depth, then there are tuition charges involved. But that brings us to where we are today.
And how did you come about being a colonel, getting that title?
Forgive me, I left that part out. As I started going around Tennessee and Kentucky, I started talking more and more, mostly in person at political events, at all these different events. And the only thing I'd be talking about is bourbon and Tennessee whiskey. Well, in 2003, Governor Patton from the Commonwealth of Kentucky decided to appoint me as a honorary colonel in the Kentucky militia for one reason and one reason only, because I go around the U.S. talking about whiskey. The more bourbon you buy, the better the state of Kentucky's economy does. Once that happened, the governor of Tennessee decided, hey, they can't one-up us. You're from Tennessee. We need to make you a Tennessee colonel. And I am, in fact, one of very few people that are a colonel in both states, but an honorary colonel, because I love talking about whiskey.
It's so true what you say about the economy and how these are products that are produced in very specific places. So it really is something that can be a boon to the local economy if you have someone who is really knowledgeable in talking about these products. I mean, we talk about it with wine all the time, but it's also true for beer, for spirits, for a whole bunch of these other things. So I was going to ask you if you could, because our listeners are mostly wine folks who maybe don't know a whole lot about whiskey and bourbon and spirits like that. Could you give like a 30-second, maybe 1 minute about kind of what is whiskey and then how does that make it different from these other spirits that you've just mentioned?
Absolutely. First of all, whiskey itself is just any distilled spirit from a fermented mash or grain. It can be any grain at all. Most of the whiskeys made here in the United States are made with corn or rye. Some are made with wheat and malted barley, but you can make a whiskey out of quinoa, amaranth. If it's a grain, millet, buckwheat, you name it, you can make a whiskey out of it. As it progresses, it must be distilled at less than 190 proof and must be bottled at least 80 proof or higher. Now, the difference between whiskey and bourbon is pretty stark. Bourbon is one of the major types of 12 major types of whiskey, and it is by law an American spirit. And there are 7 different requirements that include no artificial flavors, no artificial colors, but it must be distilled in America. It must be made with 51% corn as the majority grain. It must be distilled at less than 160 proof. It must be put in a barrel at less than 125 proof, bottled at 80 proof or higher, and once again, no artificial ingredients. If you violate any of those bourbon rules, it throws it back into the whiskey category because it still qualifies as whiskey, but not a bourbon. So 2 very distinct products, but one is an umbrella that has 12 different types of whiskey. Bourbon is one of those 12.
I like that Kim mentioned specific places and how important that is, because I want to compare a lot of my questions I asked you, Colonel, to wine. So with whiskey, there are terroirs or specific regions, especially Kentucky, that offers certain things to bourbon that no other place in the world can offer. So can you just give a little example of why the Kentucky region is so special for bourbon?
I sure can. Well, first of all, let me tell you that there are 2 different times when we're talking about bourbon. Historically, Kentucky was almost one of the only places you could make bourbon. Today, with all the very intricate scientific filtering of water, you can make bourbon anywhere in the United States. But back in the day, prior to Prohibition, if you didn't have limestone water, your whiskey would turn cloudy, maybe even black, and it was very hard tasting because of the iron. The limestone shelf that sits under Kentucky and Tennessee made it uniquely situated to filter out that hard water and the iron out of the water and add pretty healthy things, if you would like, magnesium and calcium. So in addition to that, Kentucky and Tennessee had hot summers, cold winters, which made it ideal for forcing the distillate or the liquid in and out of the barrel wood. The fact that the most popular grain that's grown is corn, and all those things kind of came together in Kentucky that you couldn't get elsewhere. On May 4th, 1964, the federal government actually passed the American Native Spirits Act, passed by Congress, signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, which made bourbon a unique product of America. It was called the American Native Spirits Act. Lyndon Baines Johnson signed it into law, and now bourbon can be made in all 50 states. Yet that didn't happen until about 2012 or 13, as we started progressing and getting able to filter water well enough to make bourbon in all these various states. Now, each and every state does have its own terroir. In fact, you guys not far from you in southeastern New York is a very significant terroir where there's lots of black dirt around the area, and a huge onion growing area in that southeastern New York. And the terroir there in their bourbon and their whiskey is significantly different than that of Tennessee or Kentucky. So hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it's just special to tell our listeners why it matters. Location, it's pretty close to what's happening in the wine world.
And what you said
Right
about
on.
water is something that we talk about in beer all the time, that traditional styles arose because of whatever the unique chemical and mineral composition of the water was in any particular place. So I actually did not know that about bourbon and about Tennessee whiskey, and now I do. So you've taught me something today. This is great.
Well, that's wonderful. That's what we're all about at Whiskey University. Our goal is to literally teach people about the history and virtues of bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and all whiskeys around the world.
One of the things, Colonel, that shocked me is how much I didn't know about the stories in the whiskey world. I mean, I read books and always these amazing things would come up. And then taking your classes, one of the things that Kim and I talk about all the time on the show is the stories behind the wine, the families behind the wineries. And you have some amazing stories to tell in the whiskey world. And I know you're a huge Jim Beam fan. And do you feel that Jim Beam is like the all-time greatest story in the whiskey world?
Actually, I wouldn't. Although I am a big Jim Beam fan, I'm a fan of just about every whiskey that's out there. Jim Beam just happens to be the biggest, and the fact that they produce 2,750 barrels of bourbon and North American whiskey every single day, 6.5 days every week, is just a phenomenal story. And they have people in their family during 8 generations and other cousins and nephews that have gone on to be master distillers at distilleries across the nation and across the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We refer to them as the first family of bourbon, but there are so many other great stories, some that eclipse the Beams. And what I'll tell you is that's what got me hooked. I'm a history buff even before I was a whiskey fan. And when we went to these distilleries and got to taste but a wonderful liquid that was tied to these people, and those people, they're just not people. They're people that have intertwined with our state, regional, and national histories. The country wouldn't be what it is without bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and whiskey in general, and vice versa. Bourbon and whiskey wouldn't be what it is without the country. So the fact that they're so intertwined is what makes it entertaining for me. And Mark, I'm glad you enjoy it, and very glad that you're moving on to some of our advanced levels.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's eye-opening. And anytime you go in depth into anything, it's always amazing the more you can learn. But the Whiskey University, I just feel the structure of your program, the instructors, everybody is building great relationships. And then you have great relationships with distilleries. So the connections are amazing. The stories are amazing. So I hope the listeners will check it out as well and find exactly the same thing.
We would love that as well. well. What I will tell you is that, many schools, you go to school, you get a degree, you hang it on your wall, and you don't forget about that school, but you're not connected to it as well, except when you get a letter in the mail saying they want a donation toward their foundation. But with Whiskey University, we not only teach you about the material, we foster those relationships with people across their region in small 6 and 7 state areas and across the country so that you can build your own relationships with other students, other instructors, other distilleries. We actually give credit to our students whenever they go to 3 distillery tours. So our goal is to get you out to your local distilleries and meet them on top of taking our classes. And relationships are what it's all about. And we just want to make you a long-term student. So even after you graduate with some of our advanced degrees, many of our students will come back and re-audit a class a second time or continue to take classes 10 years after they started, just a couple here and a couple there to stay current.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark and Kim. Today we have our special guest, Colonel Craig Duncan from Whiskey University. You can find his website at whiskeyuniv.com. Our website is thewww.wine. You can find us on all social media at The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are supported by Franklin Public Radio in Franklin, Massachusetts. Welcome back to The Wonderful World of Wine. Mark and I are here today with Colonel Craig Duncan of Whiskey University. So we've taken a little bit of a switch from wine, and we've been talking a little bit about whiskey, about education when it comes to something other than wine. So you started this program, you said, how many years ago?
2009, so 16 years ago.
And it is grown so broadly that now you have specific people in all of these different regions of the world that you run the program. How have you found that either different parts of the country or different parts of the world have responded to your programming? Like, is there a particular topic that's more popular in any different, in any given place? How does sort of the regionality of the beverage work into how you educate?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you that each area of the country kind of gravitates to different things. And we've kind of learned that and used it to our advantage to get people out there not only taking our classes, but teaching our classes. Like the world of wine that you guys are experts in whiskey itself, people are just so passionate about it. So when somebody likes whiskey and then they hear these wonderful stories about the history of whiskey and they tie the whiskey and the history together, it builds brand loyalty for a lot of these companies. So as time goes on, we kept expanding further and further, just starting out in Tennessee, then Tennessee and Kentucky. We did not expand out of those 2 states until August 28th of 2020. So it's only been 5 years and 2 months, and we're now in all 50 states, the UK and Ireland, Canada and Puerto Rico, and everywhere we go, not only is there a thirst to learn about bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, which are 2 huge products, but everywhere we go, there's kind of a niche product. For instance, the mid-Atlantic region of the United States was born with rye whiskey. Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, satellite to those, Delaware, D.C., West Virginia, and North Carolina, that mid-Atlantic area, and specifically those 3 states are just so indoctrinated into the history of rye whiskey that the governor of the state of Maryland actually declared rye whiskey the official state of Maryland just 2 or 3 years ago. Likewise, way out west, there is a huge single malt craze. I mean, it's almost like a cult following. Malt whiskey is very similar to Scotch, except it's made here in the United States, and some malt whiskeys are required to be 100% made with malted barley. And there's just a huge cult following in the Northwest and California for those. In the South, Tennessee whiskey is about as popular as it can get. And if you're in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, yeah, you still drink bourbon, but Tennessee whiskey has a little bit larger following. As we go up to areas that aren't indigenous to these huge pockets of whiskey, like the Northeast, like the Southwest, like the South Central areas, like the Midwest, there are kind of smaller craft whiskey groups that gravitate toward their local distillers. So they still drink the Buffalo Trace and the Jim Beam products. But, you've got a wonderful distillery called Bully Boy on the east, not too far from Boston. And they have their own following. They have a local following, they have a state following, and they actually ship to multiple states in the country. And they may not be as popular in those states, but fantastic whiskey all the same.
We actually have a distillery right here in Franklin, Mass, Glen Farmer, that makes bourbon now as well. So, yeah, it's everywhere. And you touched on the American Spirits Act, about the history. I want our listeners to really hear about some of this. It's shocking how political whiskey was in this country. And I don't think our listeners understand how much impact whiskey had on this country. Can you just give some overview of the history going back to the government involvement and taxes and just a little bit of that, so people can understand how related it is?
But let me just say that taxes and the government and whiskey are not only so intertwined, but they literally depended on each other for a number of things. The very first tax ever passed in the United States was the whiskey tax, or excise tax, passed by Alexander Hamilton when he served as the Secretary of Treasury for George Washington. And that tax was imposed on distillers to help pay for the war. Kind of considered it a sin tax at the time, but it was such a distasteful thing for veteran farmers that actually helped liberate the United States from the British, that when the U.S. government imposed taxes on them, they rebelled. And all over the state of Pennsylvania and Maryland, there were huge rebellions, to the point that George Washington had to garner 13,000 militiamen from 4 different states in order to put the rebellion down. You hear about things all the time where politics is going on, sending the National Guard here or there. Whiskey was the first time that happened. And it was in 1794 in western Pennsylvania, just outside Pittsburgh. But even as late as 1964, when they passed the American Native Spirits Act, the Coopers and their lobbyists had a great deal of influence on Congress at the time. So they made sure that before we defined what bourbon was, that it had to be made in a new charred oak American barrel. New because that way they would have to buy a barrel every time from the Coopers. It also has significantly more flavor when it's new, but that's not why it got passed that way. It's because of the Cooper's lobby, and they wanted barrels to be used for bourbon as opposed to anything else. So no matter what you talk about, the 3-tiered system in almost every state in the United States, where the people who make the bourbon or whiskey can't distribute it, and the people that distribute it can't sell it at liquor stores, and there's a 3-tiered system that is all based in politics and some screwy things that happened during Prohibition. So we have a class called The Politics and Laws of Whiskey, just one of our 130 classes. But Mark, I'd love for you to take that at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're huge, like in the wine world, we're huge label and tech sheet geeks. And I think one of the things, I'm hoping this is right, but I compare a wine tech sheet to a whiskey's mash bill, because if our listeners have a whiskey that they like and they research it and find out what that mash bill is, chances are they'll find the style they like to drink and then can compare that to other mash bills of another whiskey. Do you feel that's comparable to the wine's tech sheet?
I really do. They are very, very similar. The one difference would be that about 30% of the flavor of bourbon and whiskeys come from the mash bill, which is the recipe for the whiskey, and from the yeast strain, and 70% of the flavor and 100% of the color from bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and most North American whiskeys come from the barrel. So not only what type of barrel it's aged in, where in the warehouse it's aged, for how long, and 70% of that flavor literally comes from going in and out of the barrel, which is why so many wineries love to get bourbon and Tennessee whiskey barrels to age their wine in. Well, the reverse is also correct, because there are many bourbon and whiskey makers that are finishing their bourbon in former wine casks just to soften it up or to give it a little twist of flavor. But 70% of the flavor does in fact come from the barrel, but very similar to wine, the way it's made.
So, Colonel, one of the other things Kim and I tell our listeners all the time in the wine world is that there are basically 5 huge corporations that make 90% of what is seen on a store shelf. And in bourbon, 96% of bourbon comes from Kentucky. I believe 95% is made by 10 distillers. So
13 different distillers. Absolutely. Right on target.
but it seems opposite to me. Like in the wine world, I don't seek out those big brands. But in the bourbon world and the whiskey world, I'm seeking out those big brands. You feel that's the trend in bourbon, that people want the big brands versus the little guy, the little families?
No, I'm going to say it's split, although the larger share is with those big brands. And it is because of the longer histories, but it's also because of the consistency of those brands. A lot of the craft distilleries will come out with something, and their flagship brand may be something that is their gold standard, that they try and meet that consistent same profile over and over again. But 70-80% of the brands that a craft distillery will come out with may be different from year to year and season to season. So when somebody finds something that they like, they tend to gravitate toward that over and over again. And the fact that we have something called the Big Three in the bourbon business, 3 companies make 70% of all the whiskey in the United States. And as you mentioned, 95% of it is made from those 13 major distillers. The fact of the matter is there is lots of room for craft distillers, medium distillers all over the country. And just like wine, with wine, I'm sure there are so many labels that you probably couldn't get to them in your lifetime. In the United States, there are 3,000 craft distillers. There are only 13 major companies, but there are 3,000 craft distillers. So it's hard to work your way through all the minutiae or the little distilleries unless you can actually get to those areas, because they may only be available in the states that they're made in.
How would you suggest to someone who doesn't have much experience with whiskey but wants to start tasting and kind of start learning about it? How would you suggest to a complete novice from a tasting perspective? Because, when you're not used to drinking distilled spirits, it can be really hard to get beyond that higher level of alcohol, especially if you're a beer drinker or you're a wine drinker. What advice would you give to the novice whiskey drinker on how to start?
First of all, I would tell you what you just said is probably the biggest thing, that when somebody first gets involved in bourbon or whiskey, that at first, until their palate develops for the higher proof, everything tastes the same. Everything tastes like bourbon. Everything tastes like whiskey. And until let me take a step back and let you know that 38% of your taste buds are hereditary. If your mom and dad had it, you probably do too. But 62% of your taste buds can be educated over time. So the more you drink wine, the more you drink whiskey, the more you drink beer, the more nuances you can begin to pick out. So I suggest they stop by and see you a lot more often, because the more wine they drink, the more they're going to be educated in wine. Similar to that, they're welcome to come to Whiskey University, but you could literally Google 5 different types of bourbon or whiskey and then try each of those. At first, many of them, even that are vastly different in their makeup, when you're not used to drinking it, things tend to taste similar. So a weeded bourbon, a high rye bourbon, a traditional bourbon, to me, taste completely different. But if you're just picking up bourbon for the first time, you may think that those things taste exactly the same. So my suggestion would be start out with a few finished bourbons and a few flavored whiskeys. And as you do that, no disrespect, but we call flavored whiskeys the gateway drug to bourbon. So, as you're trying a few of those flavors, the flavors are 2.5% sweetener and artificial flavor. They're not bourbon, they're whiskeys, but flavored whiskeys, after you try them, you're going to get a very distinct taste. As you gravitate towards some of the higher proof things and the more traditional things, after you've tried a few of those finished brands and those flavored whiskeys, you'll start to pick up things like vanilla and caramel are very, very common in most bourbons and Tennessee whiskeys. Some Tennessee whiskeys present a little bit of anise or black licorice. So some present a little banana flavor. Jim Beam, as Mark brought up earlier, a fair number of sophisticated palates get peanuts on it. Yet if you weren't used to drinking or being able to sift through that stuff, at first you're not going to be overly impressed because everything tends to taste the same unless you start out with a really good palate or you're used to drinking some of the higher proof. So Kim, I know, can I ask you this? When you first started drinking wine, were you a natural at picking out all the flavors, or did it take
Absolutely not. And I remember learning how to drink or learning how to taste spirits in my first retail job many, many years ago. And I remember having to be coached through how to taste rum, how to taste whiskey, and just like standing over the sink and just wanting to spit it all out because it was so difficult for
that's
my poor
hilarious.
25-year-old palate. Had no idea what I was doing. But
Kim, that is so funny because in our two intro classes, Whiskey 101 and Bourbon 201, we try and take a few minutes to teach people how to taste, but we try and make it so it's not intimidating. And not only that, after we teach them, we basically tell them after that, you can do it any way you want. But if you want to start to develop your palate and your nose to pick up more things, it would help if you did these certain things. And we not only tell them, but we explain why. Mm-hmm. And that helps. But I was in the same boat. I mean, when I first started drinking, I would read one book and somebody's getting this out of it, and I'd read another book and the same whiskey and somebody's getting something else out of it, and I thought there was something wrong with my palate. Now that I've been drinking a lot, I do get a lot of those flavors, but consider myself maybe an 8.5 on a scale of 10 as it relates to the palate. So I'm getting a lot of things on it, but there are far more experts. And I will tell you, in our industry, I'm not sure about the wine industry, but women can pick up more larger variation of flavors than men can.
I've heard that. I don't know how true it is, but I've definitely heard that.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Colonel, was trends. This is something, when Trump first was his first presidency, he put a tariff on Scotch. And at that time, bourbon was going crazy because people were getting off Scotch, got on bourbon. It led to allocations. You couldn't get a lot of the products you could get before. Now it seems, well, when the Scotch tariff came off, the Scotch prices never came down and people never went back to Scotch, which was good for bourbon. But now it seems like bourbon has slowed down a little bit. There's more allocated stuff hitting the shelves. What are you seeing for trends? Or are you worried about anything in the bourbon trendy world?
There are a lot of people in our industry that are crying the sky is falling. And what I would tell you is we are going through what I'm going to call a minor correction, depending on the type of whiskey that you're referring to. Comparing year over year, we're seeing between a 2 and 10% slowdown. Some of that is reciprocal tariffs on bourbon in Europe, so the exact opposite is happening over there. But at the same time, there are so many people, because of the time that you were talking about when bourbon was so hot that they literally ramped up their production, doubled their still capacity and the ability to make it. And now with whiskey, it takes 4 or 5 years or longer to get it to the point where it's palatable and soft enough for the average consumer. So what you're seeing now post-COVID, and you're seeing a lot of people that are just thinking things are terrible. And for some individual distilleries, they are. There are a couple of small craft distilleries that are closing up. Some of the major distilleries are slowing their production down or even laying off some people. But I still believe from an educated perspective, it is a correction. And a year and a half from now, things are going to be fine.
Great. What would you give for a shopping tip in a three-tier state like Massachusetts for a person seeking out for the first time, a first-time shopper? What would they want to gravitate towards? And for someone who's looking for something special, what would they want to look for?
Okay. So first of all, to gravitate toward, I'm going to tell you there are so many people that get in our industry that hear all these wonderful things about all these very expensive bourbons, Tennessee whiskeys, and whiskeys around the country. Don't go nuts on it. First of all, Mark had mentioned that people were paying all kinds of money for things way back in the day. And we're just talking 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But these days, if you see something and somebody's asking too much for it, my biggest tip is wait. It'll come around. You'll find it at another store. You'll find it at another place. Don't overpay. Educate yourself as to what those brands normally cost, and then try and stay within 10, maybe 20% of what that is. And if you were going to start off with a starter whiskey, it is $40 a bottle, but a bottle of whiskey typically lasts people a month or 6 months as opposed to a bottle of wine, which you got to drink that night or that night and the next day. Eagle Rare, made by Buffalo Trace. It's very soft, only has 8 to 9% rye grains, so no spice on the end, and it's sweet. So it's a good way to try a bourbon that's not hard to find, but not super easy. You might have to go into 2 or 3 stores to find it, but Eagle Rare is a great way to start. And in terms of something special, there's a laundry list I could give you, but keep it kind of short. The 2 most popular gifts are Maker's Mark and Basil Hayden. Both are in that $35 to $45 price range, and they're very good value for their brands. Maker's Mark is 5 to 6 years old and is a wheated bourbon, so it has no rye grain, just 16% wheat is that second flavoring grain, and is a great gift or a great special occasion because it looks so nice with the red dipped wax, but it's not overly expensive and it's easy to find. Basil Hayden, likewise, lower proof point, 80 proof, and it's a very nice decorated bottle, so it's a good way to celebrate. I hope that somebody or everybody listening to your show now has something to celebrate and will go out and get a bottle of whiskey in addition to their wine sometime, just to celebrate a special occasion.
Yeah, it's great. I thank you for all you do for the education of whiskey. And I think one of the more important things I learned as a retailer that I really needed was who is behind what brand. I think that's, if people are out there in the retail world, or even if you want to just get into this, it's important to know who is who. I mean, that alone is education that's worth so much in the whiskey world, in learning that. And I appreciate everything you do. I appreciate the style of the classes, all the effort you put in, all the people that help you put forward the word of whiskey. And I encourage all the listeners to go to whiskeyuniv.com, sign up for one of the Colonel's programs. You won't regret it. So thank you, Colonel. We appreciate your time today.
Yes, Thank you.
Mark,
I
thank you.
learned a lot. This was great.
Kim, thank you. And Mark, we would love to get you out at either our regional reunion or our national reunion. The regional reunion is in that South New York area, but we have a national reunion in Middle Tennessee this year. But what I would love to invite you guys back for is I would love to do this again in the same format, or even we do little things called the Colonel's Corner, which are just 3-minute clips about a specific bourbon or Tennessee whiskey, and I do them for radio shows across the country all the time. Would love to do it for you guys, or just have me back again and we'll talk more whiskey.
Yeah, we loved it. Thank you
Sounds
very
great.
much. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you. I'll look forward, and I'm going to have to listen to your podcast a little more often as well.
I hope so. Thank you for listening to The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Today's special guest has been Colonel Craig Duncan. He is with Whiskey University. You can find him on his website, whiskeyuniv.com, for all their classes and information. Our website is thewww.wine. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio, located in Franklin, Massachusetts, and you can find us on all social media at The Wonderful World of Wine. Cheers.
Cheers.
Wine, wine.